that is like the antithesis of Twitter mind. We have to come up with a name. We will at some point. Other shows have like catchy names that like it's the commentary segment, but they name it something else that makes it sound better. We still have not done that, but our commentaries are good. So, but we do have to figure out the branding of these segments, which is my awkward way of saying it's time for our commentaries this week. And I'm going to start by talking about the state of the presidential race with regards to foreign policy. Now, it's important to remember that Donald Trump definitely, when he was first running for president, has occasionally discoursed criticisms of U.S. empire, overreach. He claimed falsely that he opposed the invasion of Iraq from the beginning. An old interview with Howard Stern sort of showed that to not be the case. Somewhere between disinterest and support, as he sort of narcissistically bloviated on. In the main, his foreign policy has been brutal, vicious, and even though it's sort of countered some traditional U.S. rhetorical stances, both the aggressive, the idea that George W. Bush's vicious empire building and invasions in Afghanistan and Iraq would have anything to do with human rights, but nonetheless, they deployed rhetoric of humanitarianism. Clinton and Obama, both in very different ways, were confident of the U.S. so-called rules-based order. Trump has bucked against all of these things rhetorically, and on one area, to his credit, has negotiated a deal with the Taliban. We need to get out of Afghanistan after 20 years of just absolute catastrophe and failure and civilian death and soldier and death of soldiers from the United States and our allies. And of course, the usual bipartisan blob has moved against Trump, but with regards to Afghanistan. But besides that, Trump has represented not an evolution, but a regression. He has been relentless in attempting coup in Venezuela. He has accelerated the U.S. hegemonic and anti-people attitude aggressively in Latin America and the Caribbean. He's, of course, been racist, disdainful, and disinterested in Africa, but actually accelerated things like AFRICOM, drone strikes, and other sort of new reaches of the U.S. empire on the continent. And he's also accelerated the drone war. The drone war was a big problem with George W. Bush. Of course, it was expanded and codified under President Obama, and there was a huge amount of correct criticism because the drone war was not transparent. It was killing civilians. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't going through any kind of seriously transparent channels. Well, of course, Trump has made it even worse. Let's go to a couple of these quotes here from Foreign Policy magazine, Connor. This is just a piece that came out a couple of months ago. On March 10th, the U.S. drone fired a missile, turning a passenger vehicle out of Jalal, Somalia, into a heap of burnt and broken metal with fresh corpses inside. Whether the people that day were killed with terrorists or ordinary Somalis is actively disputed. It's also a reminder that the United States targeted killing program persists to this day, another legacy of the forever war that has now lasted 3 presidential administrations and shows no sign of stopping in the next one. Under U.S. President Donald Trump, however, an already opaque and murderous set of rules has become even more widely applied and even less accountable. This is Kelsey Atherton writing in Foreign Policy, May 22nd, 2020. Let's go to the next graph. We have 2 more graphs from that article. The elastic nature of the September 2001 authorization for military force, AUMF, is stretched as far as to cover strikes in Yemen, Libya, Somalia. The first modern drone strike, a Hellfire missile fired from a CIA-piloted Predator drone in October 2001, was covered by the AUMF, as was the airstrike in Janal, conducted by U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, itself born in the dying years of George W. Bush's administration as part of the quote-unquote war on terror. One last graph from this foreign policy article. As of May 18th, the Trump administration has launched 14 airstrikes in Somalia in 2020 alone. The figure is made all the more staggering by the fact that from 2007 to 2006, the administration of George W. Bush and Barack Obama conducted 41 strikes in Somalia in total, according to reports from Air Wars. So Again, this is no pullback of US empire. This is actually a raw expression of empire, and in many ways, simply a deepening continuity. There's even parallels. Obama had some very great and, of course, infinitely more sophisticated critiques rhetorically of George W. Bush administration, most primarily the invasion of Iraq, but also the idea of not negotiating with so-called enemy foreign leaders. Trump actually echoed Obama in his dumb, incoherent way, and both, of course, commitments to engage in torture and kill civilians. So there is actually a certain parallel there, although, of course, Trump's call to stop forever wars was a helpful factor in his election. And, of course, he was correct. He has not done that in any systemic way at all, and civilian casualties, drone strikes, and illegality are skyrocketing. He also tore up the Iran deal. Iran deal was an enormous accomplishment that made the world a radically better place. Now, it could have been implemented earlier. President Lula and others actually conducted a very similar deal in the beginning of the Obama administration, which the Obama administration rejected, even though they would go on to sign a similar deal several years later themselves. That being said, the agreement was working. The Iranians were following it to the T, and Trump ripping it apart has been a grotesque disaster. There was also, and we've already forgotten this in this accelerated timeline, the assassination of General Soleimani in Iraq in the winter. Here's Donald Trump announcing that assassination.
As president, my highest and most solemn duty is the defense of our nation and its citizens. Last night, at my direction, the United States military successfully executed a flawless precision strike that killed the #1 terrorist anywhere in the world, Qasem Soleimani. Soleimani was plotting imminent and sinister attacks on American diplomats and military personnel, but we caught him in the act and terminated him. Under my leadership, America's policy is unambiguous to terrorists who harm or intend to harm any American. We will find you. We will eliminate you. We will always protect our diplomats, service members, all Americans, and our allies.
So, of course, that was a reckless act and public murder. Trump, of course, also has pulled out of things like the Paris Agreement and been absolutely any tiny vestiges of any type of even modest U.S. ambition, U.S. objection, I should say, to ongoing Israeli apartheid policies. Of course, Trump has embraced, including moving the capital to Jerusalem. And with China, he has oscillated between a sort of personal fixation with President Xi and also pushing for a new Cold War, which, as we'll get to in a second, is very much on the agenda in a bipartisan military-industrial complex-fueled basis on both sides of the political equation. Now, what does Joe Biden bring to the table? And I think we need to really start analyzing this, because it's not enough. We all know, yes, Biden supported the invasion of Iraq. He supported the invasion of Afghanistan. During the Obama administration, he was a major figure in support of drones, although he was also someone who was on the side of pulling out of Afghanistan. For decades, Joe Biden has definitely worked towards creating a much more militaristic, empire-driven democratic foreign policy. And of course, that has been the mainstream of democratic foreign policy for decades. Now, there's a couple of areas we need to be very clear about, including one or two that are potentially positive, and then the overall big picture. But first, let's look at Joe Biden's response to the assassination of Soleimani briefly. And just to be very clear here, the only person who objected to it on basic grounds of the vicious illegality of it was, of course, Bernie Sanders. Joe Biden, this is all process.
Because he refuses to level with the American people about the dangers which he has placed American troops and our diplomatic corps, personnel and civilians as well, as our partners and allies. or demonstrated even a modicum of presidential gravitas, I will attempt to do that. That starts with an honest accounting of how we got where we are. Make no mistake that this outcome is a strategic setback, heightened threats, chance of death to America, once more echoing across the Middle East. Iran and its allies are vowing revenge. That was unavoidable. The seeds of danger were planted by Donald Trump himself on May the 8th, 2018, the day the president tore up the nuclear deal against the advice of his own top national security advisors. The day he turned his back on our closest European allies and decided it was important to him to destroy any progress made by the Obama-Biden administration, then build on it and create a better, safer world.
Now, there's one part of that that's important. Joe Biden has chosen to emphasize his role in the Iran nuclear deal and has made some noises towards trying to re-enter that deal, although, of course, the U.S. has no credibility on it now. But that would be an unmitigated positive signal. On the Middle East, even as the Democratic Party mainstream has sort of moved in a slightly moderate direction, which is just simply to say that the United States' official foreign policy, even under the most supportive administrations of Israel, has been to support some form of a two-state solution. So some mainstream Democrats have started to say, basically, we should actually follow through on that in a policy sense. Nothing on what the nature of Israel-Palestine is, nothing on full democracy for all, but at the very least, a bare minimum support for some form of probably what's now is, frankly, a completely logistically and physically impossible two-state solution. Now, Biden is to the right on this. This is something that he has not moved on at all and is in contradiction with his right moves on the Iran policy. But this is an important thing to note. These are a couple of clips from a couple of polls from a piece that was written up in Mondo Weiss that I recommend everyone read. Mark Mellman is a veteran Democratic pollster who also works with candidates overseas, including in Israel, and he's the president of the Israeli lobby group, the one that ran those ads against Jamal Bowman before he happily got rid of Elliot Engel. This is Mellman talking to a group about the joint Biden-Sanders task forces, and it's interesting because he acknowledges that there was some sort of concessions on certain domestic policy areas, which he doesn't have a problem with, but he says Israel and Middle East was not in the equation. As our friends in the former Soviet Union used to say, it's no coincidence that there was not a task force on foreign affairs. There was this decision to do joint task forces on domestic issues, on global warming, healthcare, and other issues. I think it's fair to say that it was felt that it would not be productive with respect to foreign policy. It was not done with reason. We've had a number of ongoing conversations with platform drafters in the Biden campaign, and I'm very pleased that we think we're going to see text that continues the tradition of strong support for Israel the Democratic Party's had in the past and that Joe Biden has displayed personally. And it is possible that people will try to amend the platform at the drafting committee level and then down the road in a couple of weeks in the platform, potentially even at the convention. But I think those attempts are not likely to succeed. But we are certainly alert to those attempts, and we'll be fighting against any attempt to amend the platform in any anti-Israel way. So no substantive turn in that area at all. Of course, no substantive turn in terms of massive military expenditures, which already, of course, exceed and combined all of our even remotest competitors. One area of difference that is important is that Trump has been absolutely committed to tearing up global arms control agreements. Biden has indicated he wants to work in the opposite direction. That's significant. That's real. With China, the similarities are actually going to be more similar in some ways than we might anticipate, because starting with Obama's pivot to Asia, there was a recognition that the extraordinarily arrogant U.S. attitude that treating China like a giant sweatshop and investing in it would lead it to liberalization and some form of sort of corporate pseudo-democracy like the United States. That has not happened. China has its own model, and China is competing in its own terms, even as an example, they're engaging in absolutely vicious human rights violations of the Uyghur population. But the big danger in the United States now is an emerging bipartisan consensus on a new militarized approach to China and new justifications for ballooning Pentagon budgets and an absolutely reckless approach to international affairs. It's so reckless that Brad Sherman, a conservative Democrat from California, the conservative in the race to replace Eliot Engel as chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, has said that even if you don't like his record on the Middle East, which is terrible, he is there to fight the Pentagon on budget increases with regards to a new Cold War with China. Of course, policy towards Russia has been absolutely disastrous and embarrassing and been used as simply a boogeyman for everything. Of course, it's not to say, obviously, that there aren't criticisms of all of these places and there isn't complexity, but international relations needs to be working towards disarmament and a cooling of escalated tensions. The Biden also, of course, was terrible both in his Senate career and the Obama administration in repressing left governments in Latin America and elsewhere, and there was no signal on anything different in Africa with regards to AFRICOM or debt relief. So there are some areas of actual difference that are important, just like there is in domestic policy, and obviously should influence how you think about the election and vote. But the core questions of empire, especially in a time of declining capacity, are not on the table.
Wow, that was the most nuanced and comprehensive comparative analysis I've seen on foreign policy, especially when it comes to these two candidates. And I appreciate that you bring up and acknowledge Trump's drone war, because I think it's something that has been completely ignored by elements of the left who had I think, genuine and sincere issue with the Obama administration's drone program. But you can't be highly critical of Obama and then pretend as if what Trump is doing isn't as bad, if not worse. And based on the numbers that you provided, is worse. Absolutely. His rhetorical nonsense during his campaign meant nothing, because he said what he needed to say to appeal to certain voters. And they felt, hey, you know what? He might be lying. It's a wild card, but let's go with Trump because we know what we're going to get with Hillary. Well, now we know what we've gotten with Trump. And I think it's important to do these types of nuanced discussions where you acknowledge where Biden falls short, because the same neoliberal incentive model is still there. And that's what drives him. That's what motivates him. Yeah. And we need to talk about tackling that, really, if we want to get rid of the forever wars that we engage in. But yeah, I thought that was such a good segment.
I really appreciate that. And I completely agree. And I just want to shout out, actually, for someone who really takes this stuff deeply seriously and across the board and has just done a lot of work. Abby Martin has some great documentaries on both Afghanistan policy in general, but also on Trump. I mean, Trump is an amplification of empire, for sure. Mm-hmm. And he's not a pullback. I mean, he says some things that are correct sometimes, for sure. And Afghanistan's an example. And the blob in Washington is totally real. But we need to have that structural fight.
Absolutely.